In ancient Rome, there were punishments so horrifying that even the men ordered to carry them out sometimes turned their faces away, not out of mercy, but because the cruelty itself felt heavier than the crime. This was not a myth, not a story whispered in fear, but a recorded reality carved into historical texts and legal codes, where power was maintained through terror rather than justice. One of the most disturbing examples was damnatio ad bestias, a sentence where a condemned person was thrown into an arena filled with wild animals while thousands watched as entertainment, not as a trial or execution, but as a spectacle designed to break the spirit of the population. The victim was often tied, unarmed, and sometimes already injured, making survival impossible, while lions, bears, or dogs were released to tear them apart as the crowd cheered. Executioners who prepared these events were not always hardened monsters. Many were soldiers or laborers forced into the role, and historical writings suggest some developed deep psychological distress because they had to prepare bodies, chains, and cages, knowing exactly what would happen next. Rome believed fear preserved order, and cruelty was a public lesson rather than a private punishment. Crucifixion, another infamous method, was not simply about death, but humiliation stretched over hours or even days, where the condemned was nailed or tied to a wooden cross along busy roads so every passerby could witness suffering in slow motion. The purpose was deterrence, to send a message louder than any law, and yet the physical brutality was only one part. The emotional torment of dehydration, exposure, and the inability to breathe properly made it a prolonged agony rather than a swift execution. Records from Roman historians describe executioners drinking heavily before their duties, not as celebration but as numbness, a way to silence conscience. There was also poena cuiae, a punishment so bizarre it almost sounds fictional, but was written into Roman legal tradition for those accused of murdering their own parents. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack with animals such as a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey, then thrown into a river. The symbolism was intentional, stripping the person of humanity and condemning them to chaos before drowning, and even Roman citizens who supported harsh laws sometimes questioned the necessity of such theatrical cruelty. Slaves faced even worse fates because they were considered property, not people, and entire households could be executed if one slave killed a master, demonstrating how punishment in Rome was often collective rather than individual. Gladiatorial executions blurred the line between justice and sport, where criminals were forced to fight trained warriors or reenact mythological deaths for public amusement, turning the legal system into a stage and suffering into applause. The psychological weight on executioners grew because they were not just ending lives, they were orchestrating suffering repeatedly, day after day, becoming instruments of fear rather than enforcers of law. Ancient letters and later interpretations reveal that some officials requested transfers or reassignment to avoid arena duties, which shows that brutality was not always embraced even within the system that created it. Yet, Rome continued because fear worked. Rebellion decreased when consequences were visible and unforgettable. The empire thrived on discipline, hierarchy, and the belief that mercy was weakness, so punishments escalated over time, becoming more creative and more public. What makes these acts historically significant is not just their violence, but their intention, the deliberate design to crush identity, erase dignity, and transform justice into a warning carved into collective memory. Even in a society accustomed to war and bloodshed, there were moments when the line between order and cruelty blurred so completely that the men tasked with enforcing punishment felt trapped between duty and humanity. These punishments were not random acts of savagery, but structured tools of governance, showing how an advanced civilization could also embrace extreme brutality to maintain control. And that contradiction is what continues to disturb historians today, because it proves that sophistication and cruelty can exist side by side, and sometimes the people closest to violence are the first to realize how unbearable it truly is. Beyond the arena and the cross, Rome developed other methods that revealed how deeply punishment was tied to power rather than fairness, and these practices were documented by Roman writers who treated them as legal procedure, not rumor or exaggeration. One of these was damnatio memoriae, a sentence that did not target the body but the identity itself, where a person's name, statues, and records were erased from public life as if they had never existed. While it did not involve physical torture, it demonstrated Rome's belief that destroying reputation could be as severe as destroying flesh, and executioners or officials involved in carrying out these orders often spent days chiseling names off monuments and defacing portraits, a grim task that symbolized social death. For physical punishment, flogging with the flagrum was widely used, a whip fitted with metal or bone fragments that tore skin with each strike, often leaving victims permanently scarred or dead before any formal execution even occurred. Soldiers assigned to administer these beatings sometimes rotated duties because prolonged exposure to such violence caused emotional exhaustion and desensitization, a dangerous combination that Roman commanders recognized but rarely addressed. Burning alive, though less common, was reserved for severe accusations such as arson or treason, and it was deliberately public, reinforcing the empire's strategy of fear through visibility. Historical accounts suggest that crowds reacted with mixed emotions. Some celebrated, others watched in silence, understanding that the same laws could one day turn against them. Mines and labor camps were another form of punishment that functioned as a slow execution, where prisoners were sent to extract minerals under brutal conditions with little food, minimal rest, and constant supervision, effectively removing them from society while extracting economic value from their suffering. Executioners and guards in these locations were not only dealing with physical punishment, but also managing despair, riots, and suicides, which created an environment where cruelty became routine and empathy became a liability. The Roman legal system allowed torture during interrogations, especially for slaves, under the belief that pain revealed truth more reliably than testimony, a philosophy that modern historians view as deeply flawed and morally disturbing. Devices like racks, chains, and weighted restraints were tools of official inquiry, not underground practices, and the men assigned to operate them often worked under strict orders that left no room for refusal without facing punishment themselves. This cycle created a hierarchy of fear where even the enforcers were trapped, carrying out brutality to avoid becoming victims of the same system. Public executions were scheduled events announced in advance, drawing massive audiences to amphitheaters where punishment merged with entertainment, blurring justice into spectacle. Some Roman philosophers criticized the excess, arguing that excessive cruelty weakened moral strength rather than reinforcing authority. But their voices were overshadowed by political leaders who believed terror ensured stability. Over time, the normalization of violence shaped the psychology of both citizens and officials, turning brutality into routine governance. The disturbing truth recorded in various historical sources is that Rome's strength was not only built on engineering, law, and military strategy, but also on the calculated use of suffering as a political tool. And while many executioners fulfilled their duties without protest, enough evidence exists to show that not all of them were immune to guilt or trauma. This tension between obedience and conscience reveals a darker layer of Roman history, where maintaining order demanded acts that even those enforcing them sometimes struggled to endure, proving that the empire's most terrifying punishments did not just scar the condemned, but also left invisible wounds on the hands that carried them out. As the Roman Empire expanded and centuries passed, these punishments did not disappear overnight, but slowly transformed as political power shifted and cultural values changed, revealing that even a system built on fear eventually reached limits it could not ignore forever. Later emperors began adjusting certain laws, sometimes reducing public spectacles or limiting who could be subjected to the harshest executions, not purely out of compassion, but because excessive brutality risked unrest, sympathy for the condemned, and damage to the empire's image. Written records from the later imperial period show increasing debate among officials and scholars about whether terror truly produced loyalty or merely silent resentment, and this internal questioning marked a subtle turning point in Roman governance. Christianity's gradual rise within the empire also influenced attitudes toward punishment, encouraging more emphasis on repentance and the value of life, although severe executions did not vanish instantly and contradictions remained for generations. What stands out in historical analysis is not only the cruelty itself, but the realization that Rome's most feared methods were designed less for justice and more for psychological domination, using spectacle, humiliation, and prolonged suffering to control millions across vast territories. Executioners, guards, and soldiers were components of this machinery.